He almost didn't recognize her at first, and that alone told him everything he needed to know about how long he'd been gone. She was pushing a cleaning cart down the 23rd floor of his own company's headquarters, wearing a gray uniform 2 sizes too big, emptying trash cans in offices belonging to people who made in a week what she used to make in a year. He had built this building. He had never once, in 3 years, thought to ask who cleaned it after everyone else went home. Stay with me. This is a story about the distance a person can travel from where they came from without ever meaning to leave anyone behind, and what it takes to close that distance before it's too late. Elijah Boone was 34, and Boone Analytics occupied 11 floors of a glass tower he'd once walked past as a teenager, imagining what it might be like to work somewhere that important, somewhere with a lobby that smelled like fresh flowers and a security desk that made everyone entering feel like they belonged to something bigger than themselves. He had built the company from a data consulting side project into one of the fastest-growing analytics firms in the country, and the tower itself had become, in the years since, something like a monument to how far he'd come. Glass and steel rising above a skyline he used to only look at from the ground. He worked late most nights, later than his executive team, later than the interns, staying behind after everyone else had gone home, because the quiet hours were the only ones where he could actually think instead of manage, where the constant churn of meetings and decisions finally slowed enough for him to hear his own thoughts. It was on one of those nights, just past 9, the office floors dim and mostly empty except for the low hum of the HVAC system and the occasional distant elevator chime, that he stepped out of a conference room reviewing a contract renewal and nearly walked straight into a cleaning cart parked at an angle in the hallway. "Sorry," the woman behind it said automatically, already moving to pull it out of his path. Eyes down the way people learn to keep their eyes down when they've spent enough years being invisible to the people whose offices they clean, when apologizing first and explaining never has become its own kind of survival skill. Elijah stopped walking. Something in her voice, in the particular rhythm of that single word, snagged at a memory he hadn't touched in years, a cadence he would have recognized anywhere, in any room, at any distance, if he'd ever expected to hear it in a place like this. He looked at her properly for the first time. Really looked, past the uniform 2 sizes too big and the cart loaded with cleaning supplies and the exhaustion visible in the set of her shoulders, and the floor seemed to tilt slightly under him, the way it does in the half-second before a fall. "Mom." The woman looked up, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. The hallway held its breath around them, fluorescent light humming faintly overhead, the cart's wheel still slightly turned from where she'd tried to move it aside. Doreen Boone had not planned to end up cleaning offices in her son's own building, and if anyone had told her 6 years earlier that this was where her life would eventually lead, she would have laughed the suggestion off entirely, certain of her own steadiness in a way that only later proved to be more fragile than she'd understood. 6 years earlier, she'd been running a small but steady tailoring business out of a rented storefront on a street she'd known her whole life. The kind of place that survived on regular customers and word of mouth rather than any real cushion of savings. The kind of business built slowly over a decade of careful, patient work. When a fire 2 doors down spread faster than the block's old wiring could contain, her shop went with it. Inventory, equipment, the sewing machines she'd spent a decade building her business around, the fabric bolts and pattern books, and every small tool that had made the place hers. All of it gone in a single night, while she stood on the sidewalk in her bathrobe watching flames move through a wall that had separated her life's work from someone else's electrical fault by nothing more than 2 doors and bad luck. She'd called Elijah the next morning, not to ask for money, but because he was her son and something terrible had happened and she wanted, more than anything in that moment, simply to hear his voice. He'd been in the middle of closing what would become the largest contract in his company's short history, a deal that had consumed every waking hour for weeks, distracted in a way he'd told himself was temporary, a season he just needed to get through. The conversation had been shorter than either of them wanted, full of promises to call back properly once things calmed down, once the deal closed, once he could actually give her the attention a moment like this deserved. Things never quite calmed down. The contract led to expansion. Expansion led to more contracts, and somewhere in the acceleration of his own success, the follow-up call he meant to make simply never happened, not out of unkindness, but out of the specific, dangerous ease with which busy people let important things wait for a better moment that never arrives. Each postponed day, making the next postponement feel slightly more forgivable than the last. Doreen rebuilt what she could without him, the way she'd rebuilt things her whole life. First with insurance money that covered a fraction of what she'd lost, then with whatever work she could find between smaller alterations jobs that barely kept the lights on. The tailoring business never recovered enough to reopen properly. She took a cleaning contract 2 years later, one job among several she cycled through to cobble together a living, never mentioning any of it to Elijah in their increasingly rare phone calls, because she decided somewhere along the way that her son had enough to worry about without adding her struggles to the list, that her role now was to remain a source of pride rather than a source of concern. She had no idea, when the cleaning company assigned her a new building 8 months ago, that its top 11 floors belonged to Boone Analytics. By the time she realized it, standing in the lobby on her first night reading the directory board, she'd told herself it didn't matter. He worked upstairs in a different world during daylight hours, and she worked at night in an empty one, and their paths were never supposed to cross. How long? Elijah finally managed to ask, still standing in the hallway, his voice smaller than he was used to hearing it in this building. Have you been working here? 8 months, Doreen said, and there was no self-pity in her voice, only a kind of tired honesty, the plain delivery of a fact she'd long since stopped being ashamed of even if she'd never planned to share it this way. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like you had to fix it. You've got a whole company to run. The sentence landed harder than she probably intended it to. Elijah thought about the last 6 years in fragments, each one arriving with its own small sting. The promised callback after the fire that never came, the holiday visits that got shorter and further apart as his calendar filled with things that always seemed, in the moment, more urgent than they turned out to be. The way he'd let his assistant handle her birthday gifts for the last 3 years because his own calendar never seemed to have room for something as simple as picking out a card. He thought about how easy it had been to believe, without ever actually checking, that his mother was fine, because believing that required nothing further of him, no uncomfortable phone call, no confrontation with his own absence. You've been cleaning my building for 8 months, he said slowly, testing the sentence out loud as if saying it might make it feel less impossible, and I never noticed. You weren't supposed to notice, Doreen said gently, and there was no bitterness in it, which somehow made it land even harder. That's sort of the job. The kindness in her voice, the complete absence of blame, was somehow worse than if she'd been angry with him. Elijah realized, standing in that hallway at 9 o'clock at night with a contract renewal still open on a tablet under his arm, that his mother had spent 8 months making herself invisible in his own building specifically so he wouldn't have to feel what he was feeling right now, and that the skill it took to remain unseen by her own son in a building he owned was not a skill any mother should ever have needed to develop. Elijah did not, that night, offer his mother a job at Boone Analytics, though the thought crossed his mind almost immediately, a reflexive corporate instinct to solve the problem the way he solved every other problem, with a title, a salary bump, a fast administrative fix that would let him feel, by morning, that the situation had been handled. He dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it arrived, understanding somewhere underneath the panic of the moment that swooping in with a corporate title would be its own kind of erasure, replacing one thing she hadn't asked for with another thing she hadn't asked for, both of them more about easing his own guilt than actually listening to what she needed. Instead, he asked if he could walk with her while she finished her round. She hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this was a kindness or an intrusion, whether letting her son see the rest of her work that night would make things easier or harder between them going forward. Then she nodded and let him, and for the next hour and a half he walked beside her cart through darkened conference rooms and empty cubicles, emptying trash cans and wiping down tables in a building that bore his last name on the lobby wall, listening while she talked, at her own pace and in her own order, about the fire, about the years since, about the tailoring business she still thought about sometimes late at night, about a version of pride that had kept her from calling him even when she desperately could have used the help. I should have called you back after the fire, Elijah said, somewhere around the 15th floor, his voice steadier now, but no less pained. Not once. Properly. I should have gotten on a plane that same week. You had a company to build, Doreen said. and he could hear that she meant it as forgiveness, which somehow made it worse than any accusation could have. "That's not an excuse," he said. "That's just what I let myself believe so I wouldn't have to feel bad about it. There's a difference, and I think I've known the difference for a long time and just never let myself look at it directly." Near the end of her shift, standing in the empty lobby with the cart between them and the security guard at the front desk pretending not to notice the unusual scene playing out near the elevators, Elijah asked the question he should have asked 6 years earlier, phrased the way he wished he'd learned to phrase things a long time ago. Not an offer dressed up as a question, but an actual question, open enough to hold whatever answer she gave it. "What do you actually want, Mom? Not what you think you should want. Not what makes this easier for me. What do you want?" Doreen was quiet for a long moment, resting her hands on the handle of the cart, looking past him toward the darkened glass doors and the city lights beyond them. "I miss making things," she finally said, and something in her voice loosened, as if the question itself had given her permission to want something out loud for the first time in years. "I miss having something that was mine, that people needed, that I built with my own 2 hands instead of just cleaning up after other people's days. I don't want a desk in your building, Elijah. I want my shop back. A real one this time. Not the one I was barely keeping afloat before the fire. Something built properly, from the ground up, the way I should have built it the first time if I'd known better back then." It was the most she'd asked him for in 6 years, and it had taken him standing in an empty office hallway at 9 o'clock at night to finally create a space where she felt safe enough to say it out loud. Elijah didn't write a check that night, and he didn't write one the next morning either, resisting the instinct that had carried him through every business problem he'd ever solved. Throw enough capital at something and watch it resolve. He asked instead if she'd let him help her build a real business plan, the kind with actual financial projections and a lease negotiated on fair terms rather than whatever she could scrape together alone, treating her tailoring skill the way he would treat any promising venture rather than a charity case that needed rescuing, bringing the same rigor to her shop that he brought to every deal his company evaluated. It took 3 months of actual planning, location scouting across 4 different neighborhoods before settling on 1-2 blocks from her original storefront, equipment sourcing that Doreen insisted on overseeing herself because she knew exactly which machines she needed and which she didn't, a small staff she hired and trained personally, interviewing each candidate herself at her kitchen table rather than letting Elijah's HR department handle it, before Doreen's house of alterations reopened, this time with proper insurance, a small cushion of working capital set aside for exactly the kind of disaster that had ended the first shop, and Doreen herself as sole owner, with Elijah as a silent, minority investor at her insistence, not a benefactor running the show from behind the scenes. She kept her cleaning job for the first month after the shop reopened, quietly building a client base during the day before trusting the business enough to leave the night work behind entirely, a decision Elijah initially struggled to understand until she explained it to him plainly one evening. This wasn't stubbornness, she told him. It was the same instinct for careful, self-reliant rebuilding that had gotten her through every hard year of her life. The same instinct that had kept her standing after the fire took nearly everything. And he'd learned enough, finally, not to rush her past it, understanding that respecting her pace was its own form of the attention he'd failed to give her for 6 years. The story didn't stay private for long. A junior employee recognized Doreen from the building's cleaning staff roster after seeing her at the shop's opening celebration, and word moved quietly through the company the way these things do, whispered between desks and relayed in hallway conversations until it reached nearly every floor within a week. Rather than deny or minimize it, or have his communications team craft a careful statement designed to control the narrative, Elijah used the moment to do something he'd never prioritized before in 3 years of running the company. He had his HR team conduct a full review of every contracted service worker's situation across all 11 floors, not to create a spectacle or generate positive press, but because his mother's 8 months of invisible work had shown him a blind spot in his own company he was ashamed to have never noticed. The review turned up more than he expected. Contracted janitorial staff working without the healthcare benefits full-time employees received, wage structures that hadn't been adjusted in years despite rising costs of living in the city, scheduling practices that made it nearly impossible for workers with families to plan their lives around unpredictable shifts. Boone Analytics ended up restructuring its custodial contracts entirely, guaranteeing benefits and living wages that hadn't previously been required, negotiating directly with the cleaning contractor rather than accepting the lowest bid the way procurement always had before. The changes had nothing to do with publicity and everything to do with a son who could no longer walk past a cleaning cart in his own building without remembering exactly how close he'd come to never seeing his mother behind one at all, and who understood now that every cart he'd walked past for 3 years had belonged to someone's mother, someone's father, someone whose invisibility had never been a natural condition, only a convenient one for everyone who benefited from not looking closely. Elijah started spending Sunday afternoons at Doreen's House of Alterations, not as an investor checking on his return, but the way he used to spend afternoons in her original shop as a boy, sitting in the corner doing homework while she worked, except now he came without homework and simply sat with a cup of coffee, watching her hands move over fabric with the same precision he remembered from childhood, occasionally handing her pins or fetching bolts of fabric from the storage shelves when she asked. Customers who came in on Sundays began to recognize him after a few months, and he found himself enjoying the strange, quiet anonymity of it. Nobody in that shop cared that he ran a company with 11 floors in a glass tower across town. They only cared whether their hems were done on time, and there was something restorative in that indifference that his own office never offered him. Doreen, for her part, began telling him about the shop's small victories the way she used to tell him about his school grades when he was young. The first wedding dress alteration that brought in a referral chain of 4 more clients. The elderly customer who'd been coming to her original shop for 15 years and had tracked her down through the neighborhood grapevine within a month of the new location opening. The moment she'd finally paid off the equipment loan 2 months ahead of schedule and celebrated by treating her small staff to dinner. Elijah listened to all of it the way he'd once wished someone had listened to him during the early, uncertain years of building Boone Analytics, understanding now that attention freely given, without an agenda attached to it, was the thing he'd been most starved for himself during his own hardest years, and the thing he'd failed to offer his mother during hers. A year after that night in the hallway, Elijah gave a talk to his company's new hire orientation, something he did every quarter, usually focused on company values and growth strategy in the language every new hire expected to hear. This time he changed the talk entirely. He told them about a cleaning cart, in a hallway, and a voice he almost didn't recognize because he'd spent 3 years walking past the person it belonged to without ever really seeing her. There are people in this building right now, tonight, who keep it running in ways none of you will ever witness. He told the room of new employees, most of them barely out of college, faces bright with the particular optimism of a first real job. The people who empty your trash cans after you've gone home. The people who make sure the conference rooms are ready before you walk in each morning. I built this company, and I didn't know one of them was my own mother until she was standing 3 feet in front of me. I want you to actually see the people who make your work possible, not just acknowledge that they exist in the abstract. It's a small thing. It should not have taken me as long as it did to understand how much it matters. The talk became, without his intending it to, one of the most repeated stories new employees told each other in their first weeks at the company, not because it was dramatic, but because most of them recognized something true in it about their own lives, about grandparents or parents or neighbors they too had learned not to fully see. This story is fictional, but the quiet distance it describes is not. The parent who doesn't want to be a burden, the child who mistakes a steady paycheck for actual attentiveness, the years that slip by simply because nobody made the second phone call after the first one got cut short. It rarely announces itself the way this story does, with a cart in a hallway and a shock of recognition. More often, it just accumulates quietly, one skipped visit and one postponed callback at a time, until the distance feels too large to name, until it becomes easier to assume everything is fine than to ask the question that might reveal it isn't. If there's someone in your life who has quietly stopped asking you for help because they didn't want to be a burden, don't wait for a coincidence to reveal how much you've missed. Ask them what they actually need. Then listen, all the way through, before you try to fix anything. The fixing matters less than people think. The listening is the part that was actually missing all along. Doreen Boone spent 8 months making herself invisible in her own son's building because she didn't want to be a burden. Elijah spent 6 years believing she's fine, simply because it was easier than checking. Between the two of them, Only a coincidence in a dark hallway ever closed that gap, and most people don't get that kind of coincidence. If someone you love has gone quiet about their struggles, don't wait for a cart in a hallway to tell you the truth. Reach out today. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever discovered someone you love was struggling in silence because they didn't want to burden you? I want to hear your story. And before you go, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder to check in today. Subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another story coming soon, and you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. May you never let assumptions stand in for attention.